Nice. Reg?
Gin and tonic. I don't know what kind of gin. You didn't tell me.
Tanqueray.
You're high on life?
No, they asked.
And for the record, I'm a business guy who just happens to be a lawyer.
That's true.
Okay.
That's true.
Thank you.
Fun. So we're the lawyers, right? So, and we get to go last, which is great because we're the most entertaining and exciting part.
And important.
Exactly. Save the best for last, right?
So that we can correct all the records.
There you go. I have loved being blinded by all the science over the last day and a half. And so we thought it would just be completely unfair to not do the same to you guys. We promise we really won't. This is a joke. So we'll just start out with, we'll do introductions in a second. But an initial question. So what do the two of you think about how RDRS will affect PPSAI? And should NIS2 implementation be completed before we consider a Section 16?
What a great question.
I understood every piece of that, and I hate myself because of it.
So let's start with intros. Reg, if you don't mind.
Sure. My name is Reg Levy. I'm Associate General Counsel for Domains at Tucows, the biggest Web 1.0 company you've never heard of. We have been running the internet since the late 90s, mid to late 90s. And there I make policy for the internet, and I make bad people feel sad.
I don't know how to top that, but Mark Trachtenberg. I'm a partner at Greenberg Traurig in our Chicago office. I'm the chair of the firm's internet domain name, e-commerce, and social media practice. And I represent a number of brand owners of all sizes, as well as registries and registrars, and have been involved in the ICANN space since before I even was a lawyer for over the last 20 years.
Terrific. I'm Paul McGrady. I am a big law firm dropout. I started my own little law firm 2 years ago when I left my big law firm and my law partner left his big law firm. And we are having just the best time. I currently sit on ICANN's Genus O Policy Council, trying to help ICANN sort all this stuff out. But it is it's a lot of work and it's a never-ending process. So that's us. Let's just jump right in, and I think Mark will call on you. Can you give us just a very brief, actually, let's call on Reg. This will be more fun. Reg, can you give us a brief summary overview of ICANN, the various multi-stakeholders, the org's remit, the famous picket fence, if you don't mind, those kinds of things. And Mark, if you could please jump in, snide comments, commentary, as Reg tries to unravel the mystery of ICANN for the crowd, that'd be great.
Snide comments are ready. I'm ready.
Perfect.
Okay.
Excellent. So ICANN is the governing regulatory body of the internet.
Although they claim not to be a regulator.
They do claim that? They're wrong.
Yes, agreed.
If it is a domain name, if it is an IP address, it all comes back to ICANN. So even the blockchain, if it is connected to another computer that's not sitting right next to that computer connected by a wire, it is on the internet. ICANN tried to do decentralization before decentralization was decentralization, and we call it the multi-stakeholder model. That sounds really boring, but what it means is a bunch of us get into a room together and we write papers at each other until we come to what resembles an agreement.
But we also yell at each other in person
We also
sometimes.
yell at each other,
Yes.
yeah. But it's, like the important part is the writing papers at each other. So it sounds pretty boring, and it is pretty boring, except if you're like me, because I love it. Is that about right? The picket fence.
The picket fence, let's talk about that a little bit, the remit of the org. And then let's break it down a little more granularly. What's things, for example, what's the difference between the GNSO, right, and the GAC?
Get ready for some acronyms.
There you go, yeah.
So the picket fence, the remit of ICANN, is everything that is not content. If it is content, it is outside the picket fence. That means that ICANN is not allowed to regulate anything that goes on in this room, because what goes on in this room is blockchain, and that's content. So everything that was discussed earlier today, everything that was discussed yesterday, ICANN can have opinions about it, but they don't actually get to stop you, although they might still try.
I think blockchain is not content necessarily, but the reason that it's outside the remit of ICANN is because it's not part of the DNS. That's the critical aspect. I mean, there could be content
A lot
aspects.
of it is on the DNS, though. It still uses the DNS, and as those bits flow back and forth, that's content.
I wouldn't say that. I wouldn't say that it's necessarily content. And I mean, the problem is when ICANN wants to say that it doesn't regulate content, well, like, how do you have a DNS without content? There is content on it. And so that is, that is something that people in ICANN say when they don't want to do something. They say, oh, we can't touch it, it's content. But it doesn't really make sense, and everyone knows that that's really kind of a false flag argument.
And when it is content and they want to regulate it, they say that it's not content.
Exactly. It's the same dichotomy with, policy versus implementation.
Yep.
And so, as Reg was saying, this is a multi-stakeholder model, supposedly. I think some debate whether that's really the case and whether really the different stakeholders have equal say in what happens. In particular, ICANN's funded by registries and registrars, so there's a monetary component there. Certain companies that participate in ICANN seem to have more power and control over what happens in the ICANN world. And then even the multi-stakeholder model, when you talk about the community in ICANN, is it really the community? I wouldn't say it is, because the real community of the internet is everyone in the world who actually has to use the internet, and 99.9999999% of those people are not represented in ICANN. ICANN is filled with a bunch of industry
But everyone
insiders.
at ICANN says that that's exactly who they represent. I work for
Exactly.
a registrar. I represent the real internet users, the people who own domain names and the people who access those domain names. You work for intellectual property owners, and they are the real users of the internet because they are the ones
But I
who are
work for
harmed
registries and
when my
registrars
customers-
also. But I mean, your point is well taken, and I think I don't think there is a group that supposedly represents the users, the at-large advisory committee, but that body has no power and no influence, and nobody listens to it. And so, on paper, there is representation of the internet community, the real people, but in reality, there's not. And so all these decisions are made without really considering what the implications are and the effect are on the average user, which is all of us in this room and everyone else that we know in the world.
So, as you can see, the old saying that the democracy is, a bad way to govern, but everything else is
Right.
even worse,
Right.
right? Because the alternative is governments, right, weighing in on these kinds of things. So let's take a step back. I tried to tease it out of you two tigers. They told me I had to herd cats, and it turned out it was tigers. So let me take a step back and do some of the overlook of how ICANN is formulated. So we mentioned some of the groups, but let's start first with the GNSO. The GNSO is the Generic Name Supporting Organization. It is the part within ICANN that deals with generic top-level domain names, not in the sense that they're not branded, but that they're not country codes, okay? So the GNSO is itself made up of various groups, including the registrars and the registries. They belong to the contracted parties house. And then the other house is the non-contracted parties house, and that is made up of the business constituency, the intellectual property constituency. The ISPs sit there for some reason. No one's really sure why. It's one of the big mysteries of the universe. And the non-commercial stakeholder group, those are the hippies. And that's where they sit.
And together they form the GNSO Council, or the Council of the Internet. I have lobbied on multiple occasions that they should wear robes, and they have yet to accept that recommendation.
I would happily wear a robe if they could get that, and also a wig.
Wigs.
Yeah, the wig would be fantastic. Okay, so that's the GNSO. That sounds complicated enough, right? But that's only one part of ICANN. The other parts of ICANN are the CCNSO. That's right, you guessed it. Country code top-level domain names, and that's where all the country code operators get together and exchange memos and do that kind of stuff. And they deal with the relationship with ICANN, which are sort of contracts light, which is different from generic top-level domain names, which are contract heavy. In fact, all of it works with the contracts between ICANN and the registries, and ICANN and the registrars, and contracts between the registries and the registrars. So it is in fact a private organization, California public benefit corporation. It's not governmental. Whether or not it's a regulator is philosophical, right? But it's a series of contracts. Does that sound familiar? Right? I think we've been talking about a series of contracts for the last couple of days, smart or otherwise. I'm not sure our contracts are all that smart, but they are readable and knowable, and you can sign them, and they do bind.
But to clarify one point.
Yes.
I would say that the CCTLDs are not under the remit of ICANN. ICANN cannot control what they do. They have no authority over CCTLDs. I mean, I guess at some level, arguably, they could take them out of the root, but they can't really do that either. And so that's an important distinction, because when you deal with GTLDs, ICANN is God, right? They decide whatever happens or doesn't happen, whereas with CCTLDs, they control everything. The government or whatever private entity they contract with controls all the rules, what the requirements are to register a domain name or to keep it or to use it, how it functions. And so that's an important distinction, because there's not really a contractual relationship there.
Yeah, they have little memos of understanding. They're like 3
Right,
paragraphs or
right.
something. It's pretty wild, right? And so that's a CCNSO, the GNSO, and that takes us then to the advisory committees. So there is the GAC, the Government Advisory Committee, 250 diplomats who get together and give advice to the board, which the board has to either accept or explain why they didn't. There's the At-Large Advisory Committee, which Mark has already commented on a little bit. That is the group that is supposed to represent the internet's end users. And then there is the SSAC, which is a Security and Stability Advisory Committee. Those are the engineers that run around telling us that we're either going to break something or we're not going to break something, right? And they have actually quite a bit of influence. And all of those feed up information to the ICANN board. And the ICANN board is ultimately the decision maker, and their decisions then are fed down to ICANN staff who are there to implement things. And ICANN staff, I mean, there's several hundred of them all around the world, and it's professionals and folks like that, people you would expect to see in those kinds of roles. And
But
so,
also, that's a more theoretical, description of what happens.
Yeah,
when you
I
say
would
that the
take
ICANN
issue.
board decides what happens and it flows down to the staff, I don't think really is quite accurate. And in fact, what we're seeing is that staff makes a lot of decisions without board approval or authorization. They just do things. And that is a huge problem, because they have no basis to do it. The decisions they're making are not based in the contractual agreements that private parties have with ICANN, whether it's registries or registrars or other parties. And this is an ongoing problem that really is getting worse.
And also, the council is supposed to make the decisions about what affects the internet, and the board exists because California has laws, and they basically just rubber stamp what the GNSO council does, taking into account the advisory committee recommendations. But I would say that the council is supposed to have more influence and more power than the board does.
But again, it's theoretical, right? And
Right,
so,
and then you have
so in
implementation.
practice, what you see is the GNSO will make a recommendation. The GNSO is responsible for all policy decisions. They are supposed to decide the policy, and then the org, through I guess the board, somehow implements this policy. And this is what I briefly touched on before, which is this eternal battle of words in the ICANN world, which is, was that policy or was that implementation? Who gets to really control what happens? And so when you want something to happen, you say it's implementation. When you don't, you say it's policy. And so, again, we have this on paper description of how the ICANN world works, but then we have the reality of how it really works. And, for you guys, like, why is this important to you? Well, if you want to connect to the DNS, then this is your God. This is your regulator. And they control what happens and what doesn't happen. And, they historically have not viewed Web3 very favorably. Historically, they viewed it as radioactive. They didn't even want to touch it. Why they were concerned wasn't even clear for a very long time.
So I can tell you why they're concerned.
Well, now we have clarity, and we know what some of their concerns are. But
They've always been scared of a second root zone, an alternate route. So all of these so-called TLDs that existed that you could only access through certain types of Tor browsers, they are concerned that that will sort of take over the internet from them. I don't think that that's a valid concern. I don't think that that's a valid concern with regard to the blockchain, because every attempt at making an alternate route has failed. And at the end of the day, every attempt to make an alternate route has had to connect through the DNS. So the DNS
Right.
exists.
so
Full stop.
I totally agree with that, and that was certainly one of their concerns. And so, what are their concerns? For a long time, we didn't know. They wouldn't tell us. They just said, we don't like it. It's bad. It's different. And some of us pleaded with them to discuss in more detail what the concerns were, or to do studies, or to address it in meetings. They wouldn't even address it in meetings. You could not even schedule a session. In a multi-stakeholder model, you could not schedule a session to address the topic of Web3. If that doesn't prove that it's not really a multi-stakeholder model, I don't know what does, right? So now we have some clarity on what their concerns are, right? From discussions that I and others have had with ICANN, and from a questionnaire they sent out to the registrars. And so what they say their concern is that they don't want people to be confused between Web3 domain names and regular domain names. And so they want people to understand that if you go to Namecheap or some other registrar that offers Web3 domains, that they want the user to understand, if I get this one, if I get .com or .hotels or whatever, this one resolves and I can get email and I can do whatever I want with it. This other thing doesn't. I can maybe use it in my wallet, but it doesn't work otherwise. And they say that they're trying to avoid that confusion, and they say that they think that will erode confidence in the traditional DNS, and they don't want to deal with the complaints of people going to ICANN complaining about these other domain names. And so, is that totally truthful? I think there's some truth to it. Is that the whole story? Probably not. But
It's also changing. They are starting to become less allergic to blockchain domains, to Web3 sorts of things. But it is slow, and I can just move slowly. I think this was one of the questions on your list of questions, is how slow is it? Very, very slow.
super slow.
But it is changing, and we are here to help you navigate that to the best of our ability, both for pay and a little bit of freelancing, because this shit's hard, and I love doing it. I love getting through ICANN and picking fights with them, both for pay and not.
I mean, they realize finally that the tide is coming in and there's nothing they can do about it, right? They want money. There's a lot of Web3 applications that will be filed in the next round. And so, there's an attractive component of that, but I think it's more that they realize there's nothing they can do to stop this, and they have to find some way to make it work. What that's going to look like, I don't know. And I think that, right now we already don't know what the next round's going to look like. I'm on the subsequent procedures, IRT right now. We're trying to make the rules. That's a train wreck. But so we don't even have the rules of how it's going to work. But that process doesn't involve Web3, and I think there's going to be an additional layer on top of the process, again, decided probably by staff and not the board, where they're going to have questions for applicants, especially applicants who mention anything about Web3 or blockchain in their application, and they're going to have their checklist of things that you're going to have to explain. How are you going to avoid user confusion? What steps are you going to take? And so, I would certainly be prepared for that. And anyone who's thinking about applying or connecting to the DNS, I mean, you need to find counsel who's experienced in this, and business partners and consultants as well, to start thinking about these answers, because when you're writing the application, it's too late then. You need to be thinking about it ahead of time. And laying the groundwork, using advocates who are involved in ICANN to start having these conversations with ICANN staff so we can get an idea of what they might want.
So, what you're seeing is a Goldilocks moment, right? Where we have three very distinct personalities up here. And
We agree.
and Mark's declaring the implementation of the next round a train wreck. I look at the chunks.
The process of making the rules.
Okay, I look at the chunks of the draft applicant guidebook that are coming out, and I think they're fairly aligned with what the GNSO Council sent to the board. The board did have some questions, and I led the small team that worked with the board to work out some of the last minute policy details. And if you had asked me, are we on track? I would say we're on track. Mark says it's a train wreck. Red says,
I don't understand why it's a new round. I don't understand why you don't just have open TLDs like you have open domains. Like, I want to buy reglevy.com, so I go onto the internet, and it already exists, so I can't buy it.
I actually have of an
But
answer.
why can't we do that for
Yeah.
TLDs?
Yeah, and I think that is where
Because they don't want to increase the infrastructure.
No,
is
I
the
think that's
answer.
actually where ICANN is going, and ICANN would like to have it at the open round, or what they call the steady state. The reason why they want to have the next round is because they believe that there is pent up demand for new GTLDs, and they want to handle like a big influx in a big way. What they want.
I'm sorry,
then,
did you just describe a sunrise?
or at least a common
Sorry,
way to.
there are
it's a joke.
procedures
Yeah,
that ICANN already
Yeah.
has in place for when you first create a TLD and you bring it online, and you deal with that pent-up demand slowly over time. They
Right.
call it a sunrise, and then things just open up. So
Yeah, and I think that's
those sorts of arguments
that's
don't carry a lot of weight with me, because
Yeah.
I've brought so many TLDs to market that
Right.
it's like, yeah, that's just what you do.
But if
And
they
it is debatable whether there really is a pent-up demand. I mean, that is like an argument which I
Well,
think
sure,
is
absolutely.
somewhat specious. I mean, I think actually,
They expected fewer than 100 in the last round, and
Yeah.
they got 1,300.
but I mean, I think now actually the argument is not so specious, because I think with Web3 and all the applications that we've talked about, here at this conference and otherwise, now there is kind of this demand to get traditional DNS TLDs, but that's after the fact of the round was already decided on. When they were making the decisions, I don't think that there really was this pent-up demand because the majority of GTLDs have failed.
Let me go ahead and finish my thought, which was I know, right? It's entertaining, folks, isn't it? And the thought is that the ICANN would actually, they would prefer to have a steady state afterwards because they are spinning up the technology and the staff to handle this next round. They don't want to shut that down. They want to move to a steady state so that if somebody in this room comes up with a new idea in the Web3 space and they want the governance around it for Web2, they don't have to wait a year, 2, 12 years, however long it would be for the next round, right? And I think from a brand owner standpoint, that makes sense too. How many mega brands have come out in the last 12 years since the last round that might have had a .brand top-level domain name? People say, well, they talk about the .brands and whether or not that's successful. We have no idea whether or not .brands are a successful concept because the new brands of the last 12 years, including all those that we have seen on this screen, right, the last year and a half, or a day and a half, have not had the option to have a .brand. Right? And so as we move to a steady state, I think that's the board's plan, then the ICANN governance process will be a lot more predictable. I also think that in terms of issues around consumer confusion, having the ICANN governance around that space, I think also will prove helpful as it has for traditional Web 2 domain names, those sorts of things.
Web 1.
Web 1 domain names,
Web
yeah.
2 is your mobile apps.
Yeah. Web 1, apologies, yes. So let's. I think we've already done this. The next question was supposed to be, what are some of the things that the people in the room who don't play yet in the ICANN space should expect that they may not be expecting now? And I will throw out an example for you two to jump on, all right? GAC advice, go.
Oh, God.
Government Advisory Committee.
So governments don't like the fact that they don't get to control everything that's on the internet. And this is not a specific government does not like that. This is governments, plural. Every government thinks that it should be able to control what happens on the internet. Sometimes only what happens on its own internet. You're familiar with the Great Firewall, with the binary curtain. Like, countries are trying to splinter the internet in terms of content. And GAC advice frequently surrounds a general theme of why don't we have more power at ICANN? And there is a constant threat that this will go to the ITU, that all of the functions, all the IANA functions, all of the stability of the DNS will be transferred from ICANN to the International Telecommunications Union, which is a segment of the UN. I personally don't want that to happen. I think that is the greatest threat to ICANN, is the transfer of this power to the ITU. And so a lot of times, the way that we have to treat GAC advice is to come to a compromise that is somewhere in between, even if that means that governments get a little bit more weight in the ICANN process than perhaps they should as a stakeholder in the multi-stakeholder group.
Mark, anything on GAC advice or some other challenge that people may not know about in the room when they start to play around in the ICANN space?
I mean, the GAC is complicated. I agree with everything that Red said. And you look at the GAC, it's like the UN, right? You can tell the party lines of where the countries are divided and, how is content disseminated over the internet in some way, whether it's through apps or social media or whatever. And so governments that take a dim view of free speech and want to control what is said about them have a significant concern.
Which, again, is all of them.
To some extent. I mean, there clearly is differences. I mean, you look at like a China and a Brazil and like other countries.
There are differences in degree, but not
Yes.
in actual. Yeah.
Yes, and our current regime maybe takes a dim view of having free speech on the internet. I don't know, but you see these party lines, and it's tough, really tough to navigate. And on the one hand, you want to appease them a little bit because if you don't, you're worried that they may take some drastic action, and then the multi-stakeholder model goes away. And I echo what Paul said. Multi-stakeholder model is the worst model possible until you compare it to every other model, right? What other models are there that are going to work? I don't know. And so while I'm a frequent critic of the multi-stakeholder model, I mean, I don't know what else is going to work. And I, definitely would not put my faith in the IT or other things that really are government controlled, because then you're going to see a significant erosion in the ability to operate freely on the internet. And you can say it's just content and free speech, but kind of going back to what Reg said, even though I didn't fully agree about everything that's content, you're going to find that your ability to operate freely is going to be impaired, and that's going to impact, dApps and other blockchain, applications that run over the internet. And so it may significantly change what the landscape looks like in the future and whether your businesses actually can work.
And when you think about financial payments in relationship to treasury controls and those kinds of things, any concern over content is going to be minuscule compared to what happens if a section of the UN is able to take over ICANN. So while we are, we've had some fun making fun of ICANN a little bit, at the end of the day, if you pushed all three of us on this stage, we would say that ICANN, even with all of its character issues and that kind of thing, and the fun and the complexity around jargon, and whether or not the group within ICANN itself is getting the attention that they think they deserve in a multi-stakeholder model, that the alternative of a government takeover of the internet's infrastructure is a bad idea. Right?
100%.
Yeah.
No, absolutely. I kid because I love. I want ICANN to succeed. I want it to be better, to be as good as it can be, and everything that I do is in that end, is toward that end.
I mean, same here. This is what we have. We have to make it work somehow, right? So we can work harder, we can criticize, but at the end of the day, we're all trying to make it work better because the alternatives are exponentially worse.
Unimaginable.
Yeah.
Yes. We've got 5 minutes left. Let's spend 2 minutes of it. And we'll have Mark do a 1 minute overview of what an applicant for a new GTLD should, the process, right? So application process, review, delegation, contracts, all that. And then Reg, if you don't mind, if you could spend a little bit of time talking about back-end providership, how all that works, the technical aspects of owning and operating a TLD, that'd be amazing. Like 2 minutes on that. Then we'll open it up for questions. If we don't have any questions, then we'll tell a couple of scary war stories and we'll let everybody go to the casino. How's that sound? All right, Mark, go ahead.
So again, we don't fully know what the process will look like. That's still being worked out, but we kind of generally know. And so, of course, there will be an application. There'll be a window that opens, and you'll have to complete your application within that time period. What does that look like? One, fees, right? So it's $225 now, is the number?
That sounds right.
Yeah, so it's $225, like give or take 20 grand. But that's just the entrance fee, right?
You can give it to me.
What's that?
I said you can give me that 20 grand.
Yeah.
Well, we already know from an earlier thing. You just push $1 billion into Solana, and then just
Right.
pay for it with the interest. It's no problem.
The
Go
yield,
ahead. Everybody, go ahead.
The yield, which is frictionless.
Buy now, pay never. Yeah.
So ICANN doesn't like that. They like buy now, pay now. So you have your application fee, but again, that just gets you your foot in the door, and you should be expecting to pay significantly more, especially for your first application. And so you're going to need experienced counsel, you're going to need consultants, you're going to need a back-end registry services provider, probably for most people. I mean, I guess it's possible some applicants may be able to do this themselves, but probably not really. And you have to get now certified and approved anyway, so there's not so much benefit in trying to do that yourself. So you have your back-end registry services provider. Depending on the type of application you have, like if you're a .brand, you might need to contract with a single registrar to provide registration services. But in any case, you're going to need a variety of agreements and policies. You're going to need a registrar accreditation agreement. You're going to need registration terms, terms of use, privacy policy, all sorts of things. And so probably at the end of the day, especially for your first application, you're looking at more like $750 to $1 million. As you apply for more TLDs, that cost kind of goes down because you have probably somewhat of a template. But again, that assumes that your TLDs will be somewhat similar, which maybe they're not. And the more innovative that your use case is, the more legal and other guidance that you're going to need, and the more friction that you should expect in the process and pushback from ICANN with a lot of questions. So again, I would encourage everyone to start thinking about these things and engage with somebody to start preparing those answers and doing the legwork so that you can make the application process as frictionless as possible. Again, we've seen historically that ICANN treats Web3 as radioactive. They have changed their position somewhat. Unstoppable.
You just need to be careful how you phrase it.
Exactly, and that's, a lot of things with ICANN, it's just how you phrase it, right? And there's 100 bad ways to say it, and if you say it the one good way, then you're fine, even though it's the same, and everyone knows it's the same, but they just want to see the language. And so that's why you need the people that know the language, because otherwise you create unnecessary friction when you could just sail through.
So noble but complex, right?
Yes.
Reg, give us a quick information about backend providers, but we're running out of time.
Yep. So before I worked at Tucows, I worked at Minds and Machines, which was the third largest applicant in the most recent round for TLDs. We had our own applications, and we also were the backend services provider for our customers. Tucows Domains also has a backend services provider. I'm not going to turn this into an ad for us, but I have experience running backend registries. So ICANN requires for a GTLD that you have a certain level of technical competence that is demonstrable. So you're going to have to work with a backend services provider to complete the technical portion of your application. If you're a CCTLD, and there are still CCTLDs that are run this way, you can just be a guy in his office with a spreadsheet. But that does not fly with ICANN. So you're going to need to have a competent services provider, and there are a number of us who can help you write that application, who can provide the robust technical capabilities that you need worldwide. Anycast is my favorite word of the day. Having all of the servers that are regularly distributed around the globe so that it doesn't go down ever.
One important piece I just want to add, timing.
8 seconds.
Timing, this is critical. It's not going to be fast. We know from the last round, there's some TLDs that still haven't delegated, so
Patience.
It's definitely not going to be less than a year. It could be 3 or 4 years, and so that's something to consider when you are basing whatever service or product you might have on having this TLD. You're not going to have it for 3 years at a minimum.
We're out of time. And I don't know if we want to open it up for questions because our answers are long-winded because we're lawyers and we get paid by the minute. But if there is
Wait, we're getting
anybody,
paid?
You got paid?
We get paid?
is there a burning? We'll take one burning question right there, back there. Hold on, wait for the microphone. Thank you.
Or yell.
All right.
So under ICANN rules, registrars and registries are supposed to work together, but there's a practical impedance in the system where I think in the next round, registrars don't want to take in new TLDs. They've even said, even us for .music, they're like, nope, we're not gonna onboard you. Or they're like, pay us tens of thousands of dollars, hundreds of thousands of dollars just to onboard you onto our registrar. So could that be a problem if a new TLD comes on and very few registrars actually want to onboard them at all?
That will be a problem, and so the way to avoid that problem is to have a standardized process using EPP or other things that already exists where the registrar doesn't have to do any work, because what we know from practical experience is that when the registrar has to do work, they're not going to onboard the TLD because that work is expensive. It's paid in hard dollars. They have to get technical resources to change their code, and they don't want to do that for one TLD. And what we've seen is even with very large companies that you would know that work in e-commerce that pushed very hard to have registrars put in a kind of unique process for them, that effort failed. The registrars simply wouldn't do it, even though everybody wanted to work with this company that everybody knows and uses on an everyday basis and may provide things to you in 2 days, depending on your membership. But so, if they can't get it done, no one else can, right? So you have to make it easy, and that's also critical. So if you want your TLD to be adopted and work in the DNS and have registrars adopt it, you've got to make it simple and be doing it the way that other people are doing it. The more that you require any registrars to make any modifications or do anything custom, the less adoption you're going to have, and you may have zero adoption.
And I'll also add 2 things. One is have a common backend services provider. There are a number of fly-by-nights, so that's going to make it more difficult. And also, there are thousands of registrars. There are registrars in this room that I know will take that TLD. And it's just going to depend. There are some enormous, markedly powerful registrars that are going to say, I don't think so. What's in it for me? But there's also a lot of scrappy, smaller registrars that want to do exactly what you want to do.
Yeah, but nobody wants to be at the scrappy registrars. You want to have your service work at Namecheap and GoDaddy and everything else. To get the scrappy ones, you want to go where the audience is. The audience is the big guys.
Okay.
I'm not going to name names.
So
Yeah, exactly.
So that concludes our 3-ring circus. Thank you for staying to the very end. Thank both of you, Reg and Mark, for sharing where we are, where we're going, complications about it, and the
Where
fact
we've
that
been.
where we've been, and that no matter how complicated ICANN can be, the alternative is your friendly neighborhood world government. That stinks, and so stick with us. All right, thanks.
If you have any questions later, buy us a drink. We'll answer any question.